Hello, this is Hollisa Alewine, and we're having a discussion today about my latest book, which is entitled Pharisee, Friend or Foe? And probably you think you know the answer. And that's been the case with so many questions that we've had when we come into the Hebraic roots way of looking at things, as we realize that maybe all our lives we've been conditioned to believe one way about certain scriptures. And then as we study and begin to do the digging ourselves and look into some of the scholarship and so forth, or maybe we begin to learn a little bit of Hebrew, we realize that the way we used to look at things is not exactly the way we look at them today. And so joining me today is Keisha Gallagher, who is also a Becky book author. And she wrote her book on the new moon, which I think I'd really love to stop and talk about that too, because we've just come through the Torah portions where there were judgments upon Egypt, and part of those judgments had to do with their gods, and their gods were very much part of the solar system, and even the eye of Ra being, seen as like the eye of the moon, and that somehow that moon was plucked out of the sky and so forth. But in those plagues of darkness, the eye of Ra being covered, those gods being judged. And I would love to talk about your book, the New Moon book, in the context of those judgments upon the gods of Egypt. But today we're going to talk about Pharisees. And I don't know, Keisha, is that like a word that most people want to talk about?
I think it's a derogatory term for a lot of people.
Yeah, that's been my experience. I know when I was thinking about writing it, because what provoked me was when Paul is trying to defend himself.
Yes.
And he's on trial and he says, I am a Pharisee, I'm the son of a Pharisee, and I'm here on trial because of my belief in the resurrection of the dead. And I didn't realize he'd just given me the answer as to why he would say that, because he identified Pharisees differently than we do 2,000 years later.
Yes.
Right. So that was the question. Let me go back and find out what was a Pharisee in the first century. Because if I asked, I just tried different people, like, don't think about it, just tell me, what do you think a Pharisee is? Right. And what kind of words do you think I got back?
Greedy.
Greedy.
Hypocritical.
Hypocritical was the big one.
Yeah.
I got mean.
Mean.
Yeah. I got selfish.
Selfish. I can see. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I pretty much grew up believing that because, when you read the Gospels, that's the way that it comes across. But when you're lacking that history of the first century, you're completely missing some of the dynamics. And even when you start studying Torah, when you get into Hebrew roots or Messianic Judaism, whatever form you like to put to it, you can continue and not be educated really in biblical history. And therefore, a lot of history doesn't make sense because we learn every other kind of history. We learn American history. We learn Western civilization. I had to take, because we moved so much when I was a kid, I had to learn Oklahoma history. I had to learn Texas history. I had to learn Louisiana history. So I can tell you state birds of many states, but I didn't know the difference between the two houses of the Pharisees. And I didn't even know that at some point, the Pharisees from the house of Hillel, which really line up with Yeshua's teachings most of the time, they weren't even really called Pharisees.
Oh, that is fascinating.
Uh-oh.
Yes. Yeah.
And so in taping the series about the Pharisees, we tried to point out, critical differences between the two houses so that we could see, and this just, if I'd have heard this statement 5 years ago, I'd have said, what? But truly, the authentic Pharisee was someone that Yeshua believed was righteous.
Yes.
Because he was calling out the hypocrites. Mm-hmm. And the hypocrite is the actor trying to be or pass himself off as the authentic thing. And had the Pharisees actually been acting authentically, he wouldn't have been pointing out the problem. Right. And so their own literature tells us what an authentic Pharisee is, and it's pretty much like reading our own New Testament.
It is.
In terms of ethics and morals and humility and dealing with arrogance and so forth. So he was correcting that which was wrong, not that which was considered the norm. But it's not something people are really conditioned to hear about.
No, actually, it's a very touchy topic, I think. But
Yeah.
in context, it brings so much understanding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the thing is, people identify in modern times, even like I said, when we get into studying our Hebrew roots or studying Torah, whatever we're doing, that as we study, because it's so overwhelming to assimilate the information from so many places, and we realize we're being driven back to the Jewish sources much more frequently than we feel comfortable with, because we don't know how to read those sources, really.
Right.
It's not our culture.
No.
It wasn't the religion we grew up in, and things that we're not familiar with, we're kind of scared of.
Right.
And so when we look at this historical Pharisee, we don't have the same viewpoint, and then put that with, okay, I'm trying to research these Jewish sources. It's too overwhelming. I'm just trying to learn the simple letter of the Torah, and I'm going somewhere with this. Mm-hmm. Just teach me the Torah. I don't need all this extra stuff. It's too much. It's overwhelming. Just give me the Torah. I want to understand that. And so they associate all the other rabbinic literature, with man-made tradition. That's just the easy way to say this is overwhelming.
Yes, they put it in the box and don't want to touch it.
I don't want any of this man-made tradition. And those, who I've noticed who have proclaimed that the loudest, as they age into their faith or their new expression of faith, which is walking in the Torah, they become much more mellow typically. Mm-hmm. Because in hindsight, they see, well, actually, not all tradition is evil.
Right.
Not all the rabbinic sources are evil. And they're acquiring the filters, the maturity that they need. So, I don't want to associate the Pharisee only with man-made traditions.
Right.
Because truly those man-made traditions were designed to grow out of the written Torah so that you could bear fruit. You sure had to speak into it when there were deviations from that goal. But people say, well, why do we even need man-made tradition? And one reason, like I say, if you're starting out, you don't. You will be overwhelmed pretty fast. There's things you don't need. Please, if you're just trying to figure out what Shabbat is, don't go out and buy a set of the Mishnah or the Talmud. That's the last thing you need. Go get you a nice Becky book. That'll do better. But once you get a good foundation down, there's reasons to go back to these rabbinic sources because they'll open up a text. And we were studying last night with the online class, and this week's Torah portion is Yitro, which is the Revelation. I know we think of the Revelation as
the book of Revelation.
The book of Revelation, but if you ask a Jew, what's the Revelation? They're going to point you to these Torah portions here, the receiving of the Torah at Sinai. And we were going through it, and all of a sudden it flashed. I'm like, that is what convinced John that Yeshua was the Messiah. Mm. Because, that's been his life, was preparing the way for Messiah, right?
Right, John the Baptist.
Right, John the Baptist. Yes. And then at some point, he's just like me. I have days where I'm like, what am I even doing here?
Right, yeah.
What are we doing? And so he sends his disciples to say, are you the one, or should we look for another? In fact, I think it's in Luke 7, if I'm not mistaken. It says, the disciples of John reported all these things to him, and John, calling two of his disciples to him, sent him to the Lord, saying, are you the one who's to come, or shall we look for another? And you're thinking, John sent this message? Right. Cousin John? Mm-hmm. And when the men had come to him, they said, John the Baptist has sent us to you, saying, are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another? in that hour. Another version I read last night said, at the same time. Okay, and that was my little red flag right there. He healed many people of diseases and plagues and evil spirits, and on many who were blind he bestowed sight. And he answered them, go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them. And blessed is the one who is not offended by me. So I have read that for 50-something years, and it never dawned on me what it actually said. Up to this time, he's been healing people, and John knows that. So why is John asking? Right. Are you the one? And Yeshua answers with the same thing. He sends them back with the message, I've been healing people and raising the dead. Why did the message he sent back differ from what John already knew? Well, the key was in the language. It said, you can look it up in the Greek, but basically it says, at the same time, in the same moment, in the same hour. I don't know what version that is. In the same hour, which can also mean in the same instant. In the Greek, people were healed. So that's how it was different. It wasn't like one healing by one healing. It was like, bam, everybody's healed. Now go tell John that. And he's going to know what the message is. And you say, well, what difference does that make? When we go back to Rashi, who again is one of the famous rabbis, and he's commenting about the revelation at Sinai, he says, this is a phenomenon that in one statement, the 10 Commandments were given. And then he goes on and says, and then they were enumerated. But he's saying at first, simultaneously, the people could hear 10 Commandments at one time. Bam. And then he goes back and explains. And then he goes on, as the people are seeing the smoking mountain and all this stuff, he says, commenting on all the people could see, it says it teaches us that there was not a single blind person among them. And from where do we know that there was not a mute one? To teach this, the Torah says, all the people answered. Where do we know that there was not a deaf one among them? To teach this, the Torah says, we will do and we will hear. They could see the sounds. In fact, we know that there wasn't a lame one because they not only walked through the Reed Sea, they resurrected from the dead at the Reed Sea. They're standing, they're not lame. They're seeing not just the smoking on the mountain, it says they could see the sounds. So they don't just have healed eyes. There's not a blind one there. They see the sounds. Yes. It's just like, I wonder, what do my words look like? But anyway, you're going to teach on that, right? Lashon Hara.
Not what they're going to look like, the sounds. But
well,
yeah.
you should teach them. What does a bad word look like when it comes out of your mouth?
I think it looks like dollar signs with a little exclamation point. No,
oh, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. I did have Richie Rich comic books growing up. But he says they were able to see that which was audible. So basically, Rashi, the rabbis, the tradition of the revelation is that simultaneously he spoke the word, the 10 Commandments, and he healed them. That's coming not, really verbatim. They're drawing that from the literal text. But it's in this tradition, and the Pharisees are part of the handing down of these traditions into the rabbinic period. The way that a Jew in a synagogue would have understood this Torah portion was that, yes, in one utterance, there was the word, and they were healed. They were no longer blind. They weren't lame. They weren't mute. They weren't deaf. In fact, all of those senses and abilities were heightened at the same time. And so that finally explained to me, I could go the rest of my life and not know that. Most people have, probably. Yes. If they're not reading the two sides of the book together as one book. because Jews are going to know this, and then Christians are going to know that.
Right.
But when you put that with this, isn't that rich?
Yes.
You know, a simultaneous nationwide healing. And in Revelation, it says one of his names is the Word of God.
Yes.
And he heals.
And the Word heals.
The Word heals. So, do you have to have rabbinic tradition to survive?
No.
No. But can it enrich?
Absolutely.
Definitely. I like knowing that now.
I do too.
It feels good.
It does.
You know, it's just like there's an exuberance of spirit, and it's, you know, full of those things, those little insights, so that the gospel dialogues become richer. So, and you read the book?
I have read the book a couple times, actually.
Did you have a choice?
I was excited about this Becky book.
Yeah.
You know, it really goes with truth, tradition, or tears. We were talking about how those two just dovetail together so well. But it just opens up your understanding for the Newer Testament completely, because you're getting the context. I don't think if you asked most people, and I'm even speaking about Hebraic roots people, could tell you what even the word Pharisee means.
Yeah.
What does Pharisee mean?
It comes from parush, which means to make distinct or to give sense to the word. And that's how it's used in context in Nehemiah, is when the people came back from Babylon, they spoke Aramaic, and they couldn't really understand the Hebrew. It was different, similar but different. And so as the elders, you know, would read the Torah, then they had teachers who would go through, translators who would give the sense, it says with distinction, to make distinct the words. And that was the whole goal of the Pharisees, was to take the word of the Torah, and especially if they weren't native Hebrew speakers, if they spoke Aramaic or Greek or Latin or whatever, to make the sense of the Torah plain, to make it distinct to the average person who couldn't afford a Torah scroll or to go to school. They tried to reach the average person. And that's all it means, to make things distinct and to separate them out for you so you can understand.
Right. All about understanding
Mm-hmm.
and teaching the people. But then they weren't the only ones. The Pharisees weren't the only group of teachers and sects of Judaism in the first century.
Right.
And so I think sometimes in our mind we just sort of lump them all together.
Mm-hmm.
And if a negative word is spoken toward them, especially by Yeshua in one way, whether it's the Sadducees or the Pharisees, we just assume they're all in this one little box, and it's a bad box. We don't want to have anything to do with that box, so we put it to the side. But that's not what was happening.
No. And, you know, truly the gift of the Pharisees is the doctrine of the resurrection. That's why I say Paul gave me the answer when he said, I'm a Pharisee and the son of a Pharisee. I'm here because of my belief in the resurrection of the dead. That sums up really what the Pharisees gave us, was that doctrine of the resurrection of the dead, because it wasn't a done deal for everybody.
Right.
In the first century, the Sadducees are only going to accept the first 5 books of the Bible, which goes back to that convert that went to Shammai and says, teach me only the Torah, I don't want any of your oral law. Well, if Shammai can't teach him what we just learned as an example, then he's going to miss some of the richness of that Torah. He could teach him to physically read Hebrew and process the words, but it doesn't really enrich the experience the same way if you're trying to strip all Jewishness, tradition, things that have been passed down.
I say you lose a lot of the spirit of the Torah.
Yeah.
You do that.
Right. And truly, I mean, with the 2 houses of the Pharisees, Hillel was more about the spirit and the mercy and the grace and compassion of the Torah. And Shammai was more about, they said, they didn't say the letter of the law, they would say the line of the Torah. More strict, more literalist interpretation, but what held them together was their belief in the doctrine of resurrection, bodily resurrection from the dead, just not some spirit floating off in outer space. But the Sadducees are only going to take the first 5 books as authoritative, and most of your explicit resurrection passages are going to be found beyond Deuteronomy.
Mm.
They're going to be found in the prophets like Daniel and Isaiah. The Psalms, huge. I just can't imagine functioning because, see, the Sadducees didn't think there was an afterlife. There was no resurrection of the dead. You just fell asleep and you were done. And I'm thinking, why in the world would you do anything?
I know, what's the point?
Yeah, and they're controlling the temple.
Mm.
In fact, one of the scholars that I read in here, I don't believe he was a Christian. He could have been. He may have been Jewish. But in analyzing the Gospels and Yeshua's kangaroo court trial, he says it's pretty clear to me that the Pharisees really aren't even involved in this whole process. Which one? It says was not present. Was that Nicodemus? It says he was not present when they held the trial, and he's the one that comes back later and asks for the body and so forth. But he's a Pharisee, and he's not even there. In fact, he's one of Yeshua's, in kind of clandestine, but
yes, definitely
a disciple.
Yes.
And when it counted, he didn't deny Yeshua. He goes and tries to give the body an honorable burial. So he does risk his life if sentiment is that tough against Yeshua among the Sadducees. So that dynamic, then you've got the Essenes down there in Qumran, bathing themselves to death. I mean, you went with us to see all the mikvahs down there at Qumran?
I've never seen so many in one spot. That was,
it was like
amazing. Going out of this one into that one.
Yeah. Yeah, you're like, man, these are guys who are really serious about getting wet.
They were.
Of course, after a few days in the desert, you get pretty serious about getting wet. But a lot of dynamics there that people miss when Yeshua is having dialogues with those groups. And, what we take for granted, the doctrine of the resurrection, because we've always had it.
Right.
But you have to say, who do I thank for that?
Right. Where did it come from?
Right. Who took those scriptures? I mean, if you had never read the Torah before and I handed it to you, do you think you would come up with the doctrine of the resurrection?
I don't think I would. Maybe if Hebrew was my mother tongue, maybe I would be able to see because there's a lot of hints there. But in English, no.
Yeah. We've got hindsight. We've got that ability of hindsight. But just trying to figure things out on your own is not that easy. And so the Pharisees took these multiple passages. And in the book, I give you those key passages that they take out of the Torah, out of the Psalms, out of the prophets, and show you how they developed that doctrine of the resurrection that they were proclaiming, because they did have the hearts of the average person. And so the hearts had been prepared for a Messiah. They believed in a Messiah. They were teaching a doctrine of the Messiah, which you may not get from the Torah. So the Sadducees would have been less impressed with the Messiah, especially one that was overturning money changer tables. Because the Sadducees tended to be rich. And there was a lot of political, economic intrigue going on. But it was really a fun book to research, except for one chapter.
Which one?
It was on the heavy yoke of the Judeans. And it's one of those things, you can read all these scholarly sources, but how do you distill out of all this very dry research what people were really interested in about the Judeans? And after I've spent so much time in the front of the book showing the error of stereotyping, I couldn't take the cheap way out in that chapter and just stereotype Judeans and Galileans.
Yeah.
Even though they were different, there was overlaps, there was exceptions to the rule, and which that illustrated to me, just in a very personal way, how hard it is not to put people in the good guy, bad guy boxes. Right. And it's so easy to say Yeshua was the good guy, and everybody else was the bad guy. Not really. they were people just like us. And the Galileans had certain characteristics, and the Judeans had certain characteristics. So when it says the Jews, that has not been a helpful translation.
Mm-mm.
And it's been even less helpful because people don't know the makeup of what would have been Judea and how economics affected them, how their religious practice was different from the Galileans. But we can't paint that with that was what drove me nuts. Because I can't tell you, Judeans were all this way, Galileans were all that way. There's overlap, there's archaeological evidence of overlap, but there was some like intra-faith animosity, just like between the two houses of the Pharisees, there was between the Judeans and the Galileans. I mean, it's like, you know, people from Birmingham running into people from New York City.
Right.
It may not go well.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't even understand what you're saying, you know. Could you repeat that in English? Like, that was English, you know. So that was the hardest chapter, but I think it was still very necessary, so that instead of reading those passages where it says, and the Jews, we tend to, when we hear that, we think every Jew that ever lived.
Right.
And it's historically, it's a specific group of people that had a specific set of beliefs, and more importantly, a specific set of practices as it applied to their temple worship, which would put them into conflict, not just with Yeshua, but with Galileans in general. Right. And so that was a tough one, because it illustrated everything about the book. I have to go back historically, factually, archaeologically, and figure out what was going on, so that I won't just settle for these people all go in the bad box, and these people were all into tradition.
Right.
And therefore, I want to be convert number 2. Teach me the Torah without tradition.
Mm.
And so we'll come back again. We'll talk a little bit more about some good things in the book, hopefully interesting things in the book. But the main thing is, Pharisee doesn't necessarily equal hypocrite, mean, or selfish. There's more to know about that group of people, and it can really enrich the way that you read Scripture.